Our guest speakers join me on stage, Kevin Maurer and John Luckadoo. Please give them a warm welcome.
Lucky, you climb the stairs better than I do.
All right. How's everybody doing?
All right.
Have you enjoyed the evening so far? I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of our speakers that we've had at our symposiums. Many of you were not here earlier for our membership meeting. You were maybe a little hungover. I know the bar was kept open quite late last night. And earlier today, we have with us Scott Lowen from the Mighty Eighth Museum. If he's here, please stand up. Scott, there he is. They are partners in the new display that we're going to have at the National Museum of the Mighty Eighth Air Force. So, without his foresight, him, John O'Neill, and Don Brooks, who I hope are both here with us, we hope to forge a new alliance that will keep us going for many, many years, decades, I hope, to come. There are also a few other people I'd like to have stand up if they're here. The president of the 390th, Alan Moeller, and the president of the 95th, Kevin Maurer. Folks, this is the first time since World War II that all three presidents / commanders of those bomb groups have been together this year.
Wow.
We look forward to a long-term relationship with our sister groups. Thank you for being here. It is 78 years ago that young men like Lieutenant John Luckadoo, Lucky as we know him, were thrust into the savage air war 5 miles high and 40 to 50 degrees below zero. Hitler had built a wall around Europe. He just made one mistake. He didn't put a roof on it. He paid dearly, and we paid dearly to learn how to do strategic bombing, and we're still learning today. People would go in there and they'd say, "You're with the Mighty Eighth Air Force." And he goes, "Yeah." He goes, I am. He goes, "I have a ticket to a funeral, and that funeral is my own." That's how many boys we were losing at that point in time. I'd like to read from you, from Lucky's book, a paragraph. No one climbed into a B-17 confident they were coming home. As the war progressed, Lucky realized he was facing not one enemy, but four. Fear of never returning home to his parents. Fighters that attacked with more experienced pilots and better equipment as they aggressively protected their homeland. 3. Flak from the Nazi anti-aircraft guns, which hit American bombers with deadly accuracy. And 4. The freezing temperatures, an unseen enemy in our unpressurized and unheated airplanes that seriously impeded our ability to function. All 4 factors had a devastating effect on his mind and body. There was no way the air crews could contend with the pressures of combat day after day and remain the same person they were before they joined. Lucky and others had become indifferent to death. They expected it. They were surprised when it didn't come. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. Let me introduce Kevin. Kevin Maurer is an author of several books, including No Easy Day, the first-hand account of a mission that killed Osama bin Laden. No Easy Day spent several weeks at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. We expect him to do the same with Dan Lucky. No Easy Day was the top-selling hardcover book in the industry in 2012. The book is being translated into more than a dozen countries and debuted at #1 in the UK and Canada. Maurer has covered the military for more than 10 years. In 2003, he followed the 82nd Airborne Division during the initial invasion of Iraq. He returned to cover the soldiers more than a dozen times. Most recently, 2010, when he spent 10 weeks with the Special Forces team in Afghanistan. He was also embedded with American soldiers in East Africa and Haiti. I'd introduce John Luckadoo, but we all know John. Lucky as he's known, that name alone speaks for itself. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. Tell us, how did this book come together? It's in the middle of COVID. And I remember you giving me a call. First, Lucky gave me a call and said, this gentleman's calling me up, wants to do a book on me. Yeah. And we're in the middle of COVID. You ain't flying anywhere. You're not moving anywhere. We all went through it. But how did you put a book together during that time period?
I was reading the Military Times, and they had a Q&A with Lucky. And you remember doing that Q&A? Mm-hmm. And I remember reading the answers and thinking, there's so much more to this story than the answers and the space that they had. And so I did a quick search. I checked Amazon, I checked Barnes & Noble. I was convinced that this Q&A was for a book that you had done. No book. And so I just looked you up, and I remember calling and basically asking if there was a book, and when there wasn't, I just wanted to write this story. I just felt there was something pulling me to write this. I mean, John Lucky Luckadoo, for God's sake. You get a cooler name. But what really struck me, and I think we'll get deeper into this, is the more we talked and the more we unpacked it, we learned about Sully. Right, we learned about Lucky's aspirations to join the Royal Canadian Air Force first. I mean, there's such a rich story here, and then the more we talked, the deeper we got in, and the courage I think that you showed to really expose not just what happened, but what you were feeling. I think that's why I think people respond to this book, is that there's a real humanity to it, and I think that the way you tell your story. Makes it so that we understand the crews that are climbing into these B-17s and doing these missions, and it's not easy. And so that's where it started. And I remember talking to you, Mike, and then I remember getting on the website that you guys have, this 100th Bonglu website, which is the greatest thing I've ever seen. I mean, that database is amazing. So well done. But it all started with a Q&A and a phone call, really. That's where it goes. I mean, I don't know what you remember from that, but...
Well, it was really startling to suddenly get a phone call out of the blue from a stranger, total stranger, saying they wanted to do a book about me. First he wanted to know where my book was, and I said, there is no book. And he said, well, there should be, and would you collaborate with me or consider collaborating with me to tell your story? And I said, well, give me a minute to think about it. Anyway, I am appreciative of the counsel and the help that Mike and Nancy Putnam and others with the group offered me immediately about dealing with the publishing of an account of the Second World War not really give full consideration to the trauma that I was going to experience in trying to relive
That's what I was gonna come to you next.
the experience that I had in the 10 months that I was with the Bloody Bomb Group as a hairy-headed college student. And unfortunately, just as we began to be interviewed or get together and start reciting as best I could remember what I did, how I did it, when I did it, was going to have a profound effect on me. And I didn't realize that.
How did you open up Pandora's box? Because you,
With great difficulty, because when you think about it, the bottom line was that these were probably the most unhappy days of my life. And to have to regurgitate them so that they could be put down into readable narration was not an experience I really looked forward to. But I discovered, much to my surprise, that it was somewhat cathartic. That in the process of being prodded to recall with specificity, that's a good word.
how do you spell that?
How I did it, and my comrades did it, and what effect it had on me was quite a revelation. And I don't know whether Kevin has had any similar experiences with others that he's collaborated with on his other books, but my first reaction when he proposed that we collaborate on writing this book was, well, I'd like to know your writing style. I'd like to have some idea of how you put things together, because I don't know you, and you don't know me. So we're going to get to know each other in this process. And therefore, I think it's only fair that I appraise or give some consideration to how you go about this. And you're going to have to educate me. Well, I ended up educating him as to Air Force parlance.
Exactly.
He's not a pilot. And so I had to acclimate him to the terminology and the manner in which pilots relate their stories and their experiences. And so it was a mutual give and take. And as we began that, the pandemic occurred. And Kevin said, well, I had planned to come to Dallas. He lives in Wilmington, North Carolina. I planned to come to Dallas and interview you for several days, and then, over a period of time, I would put the story together. But we can't do that because I can't travel. I don't dare travel. But perhaps we can do this by phone. And thus we began a daily interview, hour and a half on the phone, where I began relating the various episodes that had occurred and depended upon Kevin to put it together in a readable form. And so as time went on, and he kept prodding me as to, well, why did you do it that way? Or why did you do that? How'd you feel about doing that? And I said, Kevin, for heaven's sakes, you're asking me to recall the details of what happened to me 78 years ago. memories that I had long since tried to suppress. For 50 years after my tour, I did not talk about my experiences to anyone. I had nightmares, still relived some of the horror and the chaos of war, but I tried so fervently to close that chapter in my life and say, that's done and closed. Forget it. Let's look forward, not backwards. But Kevin wanted me to look backwards.
Kevin, don't you realize that Pandora's box, it's not going back in? How is that responsibility of taking this information and doing that with Lucky and putting it into a cohesive story? I gotta tell you, this is one of the most riveting books I've read, personal, having to deal with flying B-17s on the ground, going to the Silver Wings pub and everything else, and you drew that out of them, and then how did you piece that together, but also know that you opened up a wound in a person that hasn't really put that out there. You dove deeper than anybody I know to do a story. The only other stories that really resonate from books being out is Frank Murphy's book, Luck of the Draw. Gary Crosby's book is out there. This book is amazing, and also John Alden Clark's book is staggering. All these 4 books, if you have those, it will tell you a lot of information, but right here, to get that out of Lucky. Now, I've sat with Lucky probably 4 or 5 times, went to his house back in early 2000s and watched him speak, and he didn't bring up a quarter of what's inside this book. And he's not going to tell those stories today because he's got to sell this damn book. I'm only going to let you do a few of them.
I mean, to me, the story is I take stories seriously, so I don't go into this easily. Like, I knew as soon as we were going to go down this road, and I early in the process I mentioned that this is not going to be easy and it's not going to be fun, but it's important because this is an important story to tell. But I think Lucky, articulated it perfectly. I think it's a lot. It's a difficult thing, and I take that very seriously, and I try to do the best job I can, because if I'm going to make someone like Lucky relive some of the worst months of his life, I damn well better do a good job telling, right? And so I take that very seriously from the beginning. I'm thankful that it was cathartic. I know that we, I know for a fact on a daily basis he wasn't looking forward to hearing me on the phone. But we got a really good shorthand of it, and you could feel the story coming to life. The first time, the first couple of tellings, it's pretty rudimentary. It's pretty piloty, right? It's like a checklist. Then I did this, and then I did this, and then we started to get deeper into, how did you feel about that? What did that smell like? That kind of stuff. And you start asking those questions, it becomes very visceral. And I applaud Lucky, and I applaud the other guys I've worked with who are willing to trust me with their story. It's important to me to get that trust in it, and I don't take it lightly. So I'm lucky in a way, for lack of better words, because you trust me to do it, but you also have the courage to tell me and to really expose it. And I think that's the power of this book. I think it's one of the rare books, particularly around World War II, that gets deep into the cost. And that cost is important that we don't forget.
Well, I was the lucky one, because you can certainly tell that to have been approached by someone as experienced and practiced and proven also in his ability to write.
You came up with the name of this book, Lucky, in a phone call that we had. Do you mind telling people how you came up with it?
Well, I tried to emphasize and impress Kevin with the fact that, in retrospect, it was perfectly apparent to me that it was not how well you did your job as an airman. The bottom line was it was dumb luck that you survived. And I have been incredibly lucky all through my life. Kevin is another example of my good fortune to have, I guess, made the right choices, but also had my path crossed with others who have been influential and helpful and beneficial to my survival. Because bottom line, that's what we do in war. We try to survive.
And you were damn lucky.
And I was just goddamn lucky.
You wanted that for the title of the book, but the publisher wouldn't go for it, so we cut it down a little bit.
It's rare that you get a publisher from the beginning when you actually pitch a book and they buy that book, that they take your title all the way. And there's only a couple of the books that I've been through. The Corregidor book I finished had a much different title, which I liked better than the book title they gave it. So
St. Martin's Press has been very, very
amazing.
supportive of this project from the beginning and going in there, and they sent all of this promo stuff out there, and they really are excited about the book when I've talked to the publisher. And
Well, I was very skeptical, Mike, that the publishers would accept that profane title that I had selected, but I really was so intent on making it very plain that anybody who survives war is incredibly lucky. And you do have to have a guardian angel on your shoulder. And you may attribute it to divine providence or any other characteristic that you want to attach to it. But to me, it's just dumb luck.
Kevin, how'd you go about balancing the reality of war with also some of the humorous aspects that are inside the book? Because it's not always easy to tell a story in its realm, to go from the intensity of being 5 miles high, facing fighters, and then come down on the ground, and you also have some aspects inside the book that, you're going to laugh at, people are going to snicker at. And you have to balance those two things. How did you do it?
I mean, I've always just found through my own experience, I like the funny stories. A lot of times the times I've been embedded, I find the military thrives on funny stories. When you talk to most veterans, they're not going to tell you their cool guy stories, they're going to tell you the funny thing that happened to them or the funny thing they did to somebody else. And so I find it pretty easy to weave those in. I search for them and look for chances to kind of ease the story, because as you'll see in Damn Lucky, it's an intense story. I mean, it's life and death every time. And so anytime you can inject something in where it's funny or you get some sort of interpersonal action, I think it's important. And so, I mean, I don't know, I like one of my favorite chapters of the whole book is when you meet Sully in London. I love that chapter. I think that's my favorite one. That one rolls in my head like a movie scene, and I love that one. So,
Lucky, elaborate on that. On the time in London.
Well,
Sully.
that was a rare time. My best friend and I, Lucky, Sully, who joined the Royal Canadian Air Force because he got parental consent and I couldn't obtain it from my parents. But he did, and he went all through the North African campaign and then was based on Spitfires and Hurricanes. And he was based back in England, where he met and fell madly in love with a British dowager, Lady Buckley. And he found out I was in England. I had subsequently, after Pearl Harbor, joined the Cadet Corps and got my wings and got assigned to Bloody Hundredth and shipped out to England. And we suddenly found ourselves both in England. And one day, he even flew up to Thorpe Abbott's, and I had the opportunity to take him up in a B-17 and give him the controls, and he looked at me and he said, "Buster, you ain't nothing but a truck driver." You aren't a flyer, you're not a pilot. I said, well, Sully, we need truck drivers too. So he insisted that we land and that I fly his spit. Foolishly, I did. But I did manage to survive that. And he said, well, you've got to visit me at my base, and as soon as you get an opportunity, which I agreed to do. But in the meanwhile, we both found that we could get leave together at the same time in London. And so we agreed to meet in London. His base was just about 35 miles south of Thorpe Abbott. 10, 15 minutes flying time.
Marston Heath.
And I wanted to meet Peggy Buckley anyway. I was enthralled with her, the stories about her. So we end up at Claridge's in London for a weekend. And that evening, she met us in the lobby to take us to dinner. And she was a lovely, lovely English woman. Very proper, but very much obviously in love with Sully. And so the whole weekend was on her. She took us around to her various private clubs, which the average person never has an opportunity to even know exists. But during wartime in particular, it was a revelation to us because we got in a cab and rode down to this very innocent-looking district, and everything was blacked out. Knocked on the door, a little peephole had opened, shut immediately, and the door was unbolted, and in we walked to this brilliantly lighted casino, where all of the people were in evening dress. All of the men were wearing white tie and tails, and the women were in evening dresses, and food and booze was flowing tremendously, like there was no war on. But at any rate, she excused herself and said, I want to introduce you to a black velvet. And I said, what's a black velvet? She said, try it. She handed me a glass that was half filled with Guinness Stout, and on the top was champagne. Now that sounds like probably not a very enticing drink to somebody, but when you sip it, you get the flavors of both. It rests on your tongue like velvet. And after a couple of those, you suddenly find yourself extremely affected. At any rate, we spent the evening going around to her various clubs, and of course we couldn't pay for anything. It was just a tremendous privilege to see how the British were handling the aristocracy, was handling the war effort, and how they were surviving themselves. And it was just an unforgettable experience. She was an equestrian and had a string of polo ponies and went around the world with her polo ponies in competition with other teams. And when the war broke out, the British notified her that they insisted on her returning to England for the duration, or else they would confiscate all of her assets. Now, the British at that time were paying 90% of their income to war taxes.
Wow.
So they were very conscious of the war and, of course, of the damage that the Germans were inflicting on them that night, because we were undergoing bombing while we were there. And but it was just I guess there maybe a couple of chapters in the book. One about the London weekend, but also about what ultimately happened to Sully. But
We're gonna get
it was unforgettable.
How was the morning after?
Miserable. My head was out to here. And when I got on the train at the end of the weekend to go back, I wasn't sure I could get my head into the train car.
So the next time you go to Thorpe Abbotts and you're on that train, think of Lucky. You promised, Sully told you when he left the train, he said, you know what, stop by as soon as you can. And you hadn't seen your friend in a long time, you had a great time in London. You know,
Absolutely.
the best time you had since you've been in England, if I remember correctly.
Well, I had no time off at all. Normally, when you're flying combat, after 4 or 5 missions, they would send you to a retirement or rest facility. We call them flak houses, but they really were an opportunity to let a crew decompose and get their perspective back and remove themselves from the battle scene and the front lines that we were on when we were at Thorpe Abbotts. But I never got to do that. I never saw the inside of one of those. I did send a lot of people to those because I saw that they were on the verge of cracking because of the strenuous effects of seeing their comrades go down in flames. But I never got to a flak house, so I don't know what they were like. But they were palatial estates where they had marvelous food and sports. They could play tennis or ride horseback or do all of these things and get their minds off the terrible effects of combat for a few days or a few hours, and it was miraculous as to the recuperative powers that those could produce.
Tell us about you going back to see Sully and keeping your promise to go and see him, visit him at his base.
Well, after our weekend in London, it was a month or so, I was the operations officer of the 351st Squadron as a second lieutenant. And that was strange happening. But at any rate, I had to check out an airplane that had been repaired from battle damage to make sure it was airworthy. And so I took a skeleton crew and found his base and squeezed a B-17 into a fighter field. Their runways are only half as long as ours. So it was really with considerable effort that you can manage to successfully land a B-17 or heavy bomber in an RAF fighter field. But I managed to do that, and as I was standing on the brakes to keep it from running off the end of the runway, I looked over at the side and here was a wreckage. And smoke was still curling up from it. And I thought, well, you know, some poor guy bought the farm. But I didn't think too much about it. I taxied up to the control tower, and the officer of the day came out to greet me, and he said, well, he was up on the balcony, he called down, he said, what are you doing here, Yank? Are you lost? You need petrol? No, I'm just here on a social call. I want to say hi to my Flight Lieutenant Sullivan. Could you show me to his quarters, please? And I've got to get back. I'm on a short shift. And he said, you knew him? I thought, well, that's a strange way to put it. But I said, well, sure, he's my best friend from home. He said, well, you have to see the CO. And I said, well, I know that is the protocol. When you land at a foreign base, you certainly should report to the commanding officers that why you're there and what your needs are. But I tried to back off, and he said, no, you've got to see the CO. So I realized that I was going to have to go through this procedure. And so I agreed, and he ushered me into this wing commander's office, who was busily writing and didn't even look up. And finally, I cleared my throat and I said, excuse me, sir, but I'm a friend of Flight Lieutenant Sullivan's, and I would just like to say hello, and I've got to get back to my base. And he looked up and he said, you knew him? And I said, yes, sir, he's my best friend. He said, did you see the wreckage as you landed? And then it dawned on me. He said, we lost Sully yesterday afternoon. He had been transitioned to a vicious British fighter known as a typhoon, Hurricane Hawker Typhoon, which was grossly overpowered. So much so that when you took off, you had to keep full opposite rudder in order to keep the thing straight on the runway. Unfortunately, as he and his wingman were taking off in this typhoon, the previous afternoon, his engine quit. And he just cartwheeled because he still had full opposite rudder. Well, that loss was far greater and had far more effect on me than the loss of any of my friends or comrades that I had flown with. Because I'd known him for years, and we went through high school and college together, we're fraternity brothers, and we're just joined at the hip. We were great good friends, and to realize that we'd had this wonderful weekend in London not shortly before, not long before, and still that he was gone. So, Commander said, I'm writing his mother, and I want you to do it. I said, well, sir, with all due respect, he was not flying for the Americans, he was flying for the British, and I think it's your responsibility as his commander to notify the next of kin. He says, I know it is, but I think she would appreciate getting that news from you more than she would from me. So he insisted, and I sat down and wrote out a cable to her. And 3 days later, they gave him a full military funeral. And I flew down for that. And when I returned home, I called on her and assured her that he had been among friends doing what he dearly wanted to do, and that it was properly commemorated and memorialized. And her reply to me was, I want you to see that he comes home. And I said, Mrs. Sullivan, I have no influence with the British at all, and this is wartime. That's not a possibility. Perhaps after the war, maybe his remains can be repatriated, but there's nothing I can do. Well, she didn't accept that and never spoke to me again.
how do you digest this and take this in? He's just giving you probably the worst story of his life that he's not told anyone.
All right.
No one in this room had ever heard that story until he brought it up in this book.
Yeah.
And in a lot of cases, publishers or writers will go in there and either embellish a story, water it down, but you didn't either inside the book. You told it almost verbatim what you just said here. And in your style of writing, that had to be tough because you're learning about the air war. You're like Lucky was in this thing is, I'm learning on the job. Well, that was the job.
So I try to, I'm not a historian, I'm a reporter, so I try to write books with a point of view, with a story. I try to find that through line through the material. I mean, Lucky, as you just saw, can tell a story. So, you know, I just tried to tell the story the best I could. But the more we talked about Sully, the more I realized he's an important person I put in this book, because he's a counterpoint. They're connected from the start. And so we're able to weave Sully in the book. Sully's got his own chapter. You check in with Sully in the middle of the book, and it gives you some idea what he's doing. And we ended up finding his diary and a bunch of letters he sent home that's in the archive at the University of Tennessee in Chattanooga. And that was enlightening. I think we sent those links. I remember Lucky reading those the first he'd seen them. And then we did actually find a picture of Lucky at Sully's funeral. There's a picture in the archives in the Royal Canadian Air Force Archives of him there.
I never knew that existed.
Yeah, so we found some new things about it, but I just feel like he's the soul of the book is Lucky, but you can't tell Lucky's story, I don't think, without telling Sully's story, and so Sully really becomes an intriguing part of this. And honestly, I just try to get out of the way. Answer your questions, get out of the way, do the best you can. But I mean, Lucky's going to take you to the best story, and just trust him to do it. And then, I mean, you saw it right there. And I got that, you know, on a daily basis. I would call, and as we slowly got comfortable with one another, I used to get stories like that. I mean, imagine though, for me, you know, we're in the middle of COVID, we're in lockdown, and I've got this daily conversation which I look forward to every day. Except for that week we took off because I think I pushed it too far. We had to take a week off. But the point was that it was such an important, I think for me, and I'd like to hear it for you too, but for me during COVID, which was not really in the beginning time, it was so weird. This was such a great thing to have for me to go to and to listen to these amazing stories. And to take that responsibility kind of takes your mind off of what else you're doing, because I knew I had the responsibility to tell this story. And so I'm grateful for Lucky just because I think I look back at COVID and that early time, and it's not a complete nightmare for me because I had this and it was important. It helped me sort of cope with it, but I also I'm so happy that, you know, we got the book the way we got it. And you know, I may have typed the first draft, but this thing went back and forth. Nancy, Mike, Lucky, they all read some bad versions of this book. You guys are lucky, you don't have to read the version. And they saved me from a lot of dumb mistakes, so.
I can sell you one.
So.
I'll give the folks this opportunity. There's two stories that I'd like to bring up. You're going to choose which one. One is about cold, and the other one is about Berlin. You take the choice. What do you want to hear?
Berlin.
Berlin?
Berlin. Sorry.
Berlin. The first briefing for Berlin. Tell the story.
Oh, God.
Oh, yeah. Now, the audience picked it.
Well, this has never been revealed before in any other publication or in any history, or even verbally, to my knowledge. But the end of November of 1943, when the 100th been flying, they had about 50 missions in at that point. And I had been appointed the operations officer of the 351st. I was still a second lieutenant. Oh, I beg your point, I had been promoted on November 1st, so I finally got my silver bar. So I had a little more rank. And I was at the bar in the officers club one evening, and the squadron commander walked up to me, behind me, and tapped me on the shoulder and he said, "Lucky, go get some sleep. You're flying tomorrow." And I said, "Why?" "Because I've already made out the formation and you're supposed to fly because we're leading the group." And he said, "No, I want you to fly." So he was my superior officer. I had no opportunity to debate, so I went to bed. I got up the next morning at 3 o'clock when they awakened us for the mission, and got down to the briefing room and noticed, much to my surprise, that Colonel then, Curtis LeMay was in attendance. He never came to our briefings. So I thought something's very strange here going on. But they pulled back the curtains to reveal the target. And there was a straight red line from Thorpe Abbotts to Berlin. Now, mind you, at this stage, Berlin had never been bombed in the daytime. And Goering, Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, had bragged that the 8th Air Force would never succeed in bombing Berlin by day. Well, to come to find out, the mission had been conceived in this fashion. There was an unusual meteorological phenomenon where the entire European continent was covered by a thick cloud layer, up to 10,000 feet. We were then briefed that with this group, only the 100th was going in alone, without fighter escort, just above that cloud layer at 12,000 feet instead of the usual 25 to 29,000 feet that we bombed from. When we turned on the initial point, the IP, we were to dive through the cloud deck and break out at 6,000 feet over Berlin at high noon and drop our bombs on the Reichstag. Well, I looked out of the corner of my eye and saw that squadron commander sitting over there, and I gave him the finger. I realized instantly that he knew what that mission was, and he had put me in that position instead of himself. And he was a coward. So I collared him after the mission. Well, LeMay said, "Gentlemen, I have, to be honest with you, I can't fly this mission because General Arnold has threatened to court-martial me if I get in an airplane. But I have to say to you that if we only get one airplane over the target, it will be a success." What solace is that? But at any rate, to make the story short, we took off, we climbed through the overcast, assembled, hit the enemy coast, and they recalled the mission. The cloud deck had dissipated over the target, so we did not have that element of surprise that we were depending so heavily on. But that would have been my 25th and last mission in more ways than one had it been realized. But that has never been told before, except in this book.
And what happened when you landed?
Yeah. More rock.
I came back and landed and hit the ground and ran to group headquarters, group operations, to Major John Kidd, and I explained to him, he had been at the briefing, he knew what it was about, and I said, Major, I insist that you transfer me instantly. I will not serve another minute under that man. I have no regard for him or respect for him whatsoever, even as a human being, much less as a superior officer. And he said, well, I can't blame you, so I need an operations officer in the 350th, which was headed by Bucky Elton at that time, and he was in the Black House himself, so I said, cut my orders. And I immediately transferred and became the operations officer of the 350th.
Pretty amazing, eh, folks? Those are things that are inside this book. Kevin, you got privy to some great stories.
Yeah, my job.
How did you look at putting those stories in a certain order that once you read this, you can follow the complete history of Lucky from start to finish, and it's easily, you're able to comprehend everything that's going on in there. You're not talking above the reader's head or below it. It's straightforward, and it's telling the story as it happened.
Well, the centerpiece of the book is the Bremen raid on October 8th, 1943. And so if you use that as your center hub, the book's built around getting you caught up so you understand the missions and understand the toll that it took. And then you get a really detailed retelling of one mission. And then we end up with the rest of the legacy. We got the Berlin mission and then his last mission and then Sully. But the idea really, because when we first started talking, that Bremen mission is a, I don't want to say a high point in your mission list, but it's the one that, well, quoting you, it's the one time that you felt like you might die. And so that was where we centered on that mission, and then we tell it around that. So the book opens with kind of pre-mission walking around the aircraft, and then catches you up on how we got there, and then we go from there.
Well, that's the other thing about the book. Lucky talks about missions and things that happened that we had no idea about, or what he flew on, or what his input was. The Bremen mission does hold. That's the key point inside the book. They know we're not telling the story. I'll let Lucky give a quick rundown on the cold, the freezing cold. This was always something that permeated your stories, always something that really affected you, but even after the war, with Bobby, and that it came back to you.
Well, that's the one aspect of flying high altitude formation bombing that you cannot convey. It occurred to me while the Masters of the Air presentation this morning was being conducted that in spite of all that Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg or Kurt Zaginski are doing, there is no way that they can convey what terrific cold we endured for hours on end during a mission. Because we were flying unpressurized, we put on all the clothing we could put on, included heating underwear and boots and gloves and everything else. 50 and 60 degrees below zero, you have a hard time enduring. But we had to do so hour after hour at at that altitude, and it was phenomenal and really a revelation to us how severely it impacted our ability to function, to perform. And surprisingly enough, when you're struggling to maintain formation and fighters are coming in, anti-aircraft fires coming up, and all hell is breaking loose, you suddenly discover that despite that temperature, you're sweating profusely. Perspiration's rolling off of you, and it freezes like that. But the result of that is it blocks your flow of oxygen, and you have to crack that, break those ice crystals up with one hand and fly with the other. So the effect of that over time after time, mission after mission, is profound. And it takes a very heavy toll, mentally as well as physically. And of course, you're trying to protect or caution your gunners to protect themselves, because the waist gunners in our earlier F model B-17 stood in an open window to man their single 50 caliber machine guns. And that was absolutely above and beyond.
You brush with the cold when you had the 20 millimeter take out the plexiglass in the nose.
Yes, on one mission I sustained a bullet hole through the plexiglass, and it created a draft directly from the bombardier's nose up through the cockpit directly onto my feet. And it literally froze my feet to the rudders. And ironically, the only physical injury that I sustained in my tour of duty was frostbitten feet. So when I got back, they had to chip me out and send me up to the hospital, where I stayed for 8 days. And of course, missed some missions with the crew I was with then, the original crew I went over with. And so they finished up their tour of 25 missions, fastest tour in the European theater, and went home. And I still had 4 missions to fly. And my Bremen mission, which was the worst mission that I flew, and the one that I ended up bringing back the remnants of the entire group.
Don't get all of it away. But I will ask you, going back to the cold, your feet were frostbitten.
Yeah.
I mean, they took off your boots, cut them off. You're sitting in there. What was the color of both your feet?
Well, they packed them in ice to begin thawing them out. And that was a very slow process, and I was just extremely lucky that I didn't lose my toes. Because often at altitude, if you expose bare flesh to those sorts of altitude, you can have your fingers or your toes self-amputated at the nearest knuckle. You wouldn't lose a drop of blood. It's just like surgically lopping off your fingers or toes.
You had another person in your ward that came in, a ball turret gunner.
While I was in the hospital, Mike's referring to the fact that they informed me that because my feet had been frozen, I was entitled to a Purple Heart. And I said, no, I'm not accepting a Purple Heart. I don't think that's guys lose their legs or, get severely damaged in other ways. And they deserve the Purple Heart. So I didn't accept it. And so they informed the guy in the bed next to me, who turned out was a ball turret gunner, who had in the heat of battle, become so excited that he wet his pants and froze like a block to the turret. And they could not extricate him. They tried every way in the world. They flew around as long as the fuel would last to try at lower altitude, trying to thaw him out. They still couldn't get him out. And you're never supposed to land with the ball turret gunner in position, because it's only about a foot off the runway. And a hard landing would crush the ball turret. So he's supposed to be out of that turret, and this couldn't happen. And of course, he had his whole rear extremity completely frozen. And they said, well, you get a Purple Heart. He said, no, for God's sake, don't get it.
Just had a purple ass.
Ball turret gunner was afraid to be able to tell people what you get the Purple Heart for. I could go on for hours with these two gentlemen. They're incredible. But I wanted to see if there was anybody out there that had a question for us.
John, when you flew, there were a couple of instances I remember you telling me, when you flew as a crew for the first time to England, an occurrence happened, a change of guard in the plane. I think this is right, that the pilot had to be sent back for further training. And that didn't happen.
I'm sorry, Chuck.
As I remember being taught, maybe I remember wrong, that as you were flying the crew for the first time, you were the co-pilot, I think, is that right? When you flew, and the pilot, as you were flying from the United States to England, there was a change of guard from the co-pilot to the pilot. Is that right?
What was the reason for that?
Yes. And the second part of it was, I noticed that wonderful brunette shock of hair that you had. That changed color when you came back, didn't it?
Yes. What Chuck is referring to, number one, was en route to England. In 1943, at the end of May, we were flying our own aircraft directly from Newfoundland to Prestwick, Scotland. It was a flight of some 10 hours. Could last 12. But in order to succeed, we had to wait for a favorable tailwind. And the whole group was there, assembled, waiting for the winds to be favorable to make this long, extended, overwater jump from Newfoundland to Prestwick, Scotland. While we were waiting, the pilot of the crew, my original crew, took it upon himself to go across the base and shack up with the WAF, British auxiliary service person, and contract a raging case of VD. So he was immediately hospitalized, and our entire crew then sat there for 2 more weeks while the rest of the group proceeded, waiting for him to be treated and released. The only thing that was available in those days was sulfa to treat that sort of disease. And he had been flat on his back for 2 weeks. When he was finally released, we picked him up from the hospital, and he couldn't stand. So we had to load him into the airplane. And he said, well, Lucky, you're going to have to fly this thing because I can't. And I said, that's pretty obvious, isn't it? So when my classmates and I had all replaced all of the co-pilots leaders in this group, which never happened in any other group in the 8th Air Force. Nobody ever knows to this day why it was done, but it was done. There were 40 of us, only 4 of us completed the tour. I was one. But this replacement of the second in command of the crew was a traumatic event for many crews, and some accepted the inevitable and went on from there, but some, like my crew, took exception to it, and they made my life hell. They did everything in the world to discourage me and try to force me to resign, I guess, or beg for another crew, but I stuck it out. And the navigator and the bombardier in particular were very detrimental to my health. I called them over after it was possible. It was apparent that I was going to have to fly them to combat, and reminded them that I was going to be the reason for them to get there because the pilot couldn't. And I told the navigator at that point that it rested on his shoulders to make landfall on the dot, or else I would personally throw his butt out of the airplane in that direction. So that tended to level the playing field a little bit, but as you can imagine, the atmosphere that existed on this crew, who was supposed to be a team and work together and protect each other and fulfill their respective responsibilities. And here we were policing our backfield all the time.
Got time for 2 more questions.
Hi, I'm Kate Wall. My dad was Don Atkinson. I arrived in Fort Rapids around October. Tried to arrive in May, but they crashed. But anyway, they arrived in October. So my question is for Kevin. Kevin, you've been blessed with the art of verbiage. And when you wrote this story, did you ever have any incidences that you would worry that it was not the right story that Luckadoo would want? So how did that communication go? Did you back and forth all the time? But you have, I've read some of the passages, and you have such a way with words, and we're really happy that you were able to put this book together.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We just, from the beginning, I was transparent. I wrote, he got to read everything, so he's read this thing warts and all, and I think he can tell you what you guys are going to read, which, just to be clear, that advanced reader is still uncorrected. We caught most of those, but there's lots of mistakes. It wasn't all that pretty at first, because it takes you a second to really, writing's rewriting, so it takes me about 7 drafts to get to what you're reading. So we just, from the beginning, when we were talking about doing the book, I told him I would share the pages with him. It was something that he wanted to read. I warned him that they wouldn't be very good for a while, and then he was patient, and each time we got to another draft, and each time I sent it to him, the book got better. I will say this, I initially had a structure for this book that was a lot more complicated. And one that Lucky from the beginning told me, this is not going to work. And I said, no, trust me, I know what I'm doing. He was right, it did not work.
Mike, is this
What's that?
one question?
One more question.
I know you were going for a second.
So, do you think your usefulness was part of the problem with you and your crew after this pilot incident, or was it your personality, or because you said your crew was kind of at odds with each other? That's what I understood? Is that correct?
You never go to war and come back the same person.
Yeah. But that incident, when you were trying to get to England, at least that's the way I understood it. You had problems after your pilot got VD, and it sounded like the crew wasn't getting along, and I wondered why that was. Just
The crew wasn't getting along with him.
Well, Well, the reality of war certainly brought home very quickly that regardless of our personal feelings and personalities, that we had to work together or we weren't going to come back. And we had to depend on each other to fulfill their respective responsibilities or we just weren't going to survive. So it did tend to certainly alter the atmosphere and the climate. And you had to put aside a lot of personal animosities and that sort of thing because even though they were juvenile or sophomoric or whatever you want to call them, they were out of place and they weren't going to work.
And it eventually happened with your career.
Yes. I'm sorry I didn't answer the other question that Chuck rose, and that was about my hair turning white in the course of a mission. And that was indicative, and it's emblazoned on the wall at the National Museum down in, the quotation is in New Orleans, that in the course of one mission, it was so horrendous that your hair could turn white at 21. And that's the kind of trauma that one can experience. Sometimes it's a streak, sometimes it's a splotch, or maybe your whole head turns white.
Gentlemen, thank you for a very riveting
While we're all together, I would like to take this opportunity to remind all of you here at this 100th Bond Group reunion that the people that are responsible for your being here and arranging for all of the amenities that we enjoy are all volunteers. They don't get a dime for what they do. They worked for over a year to put this together. And I think you owe them a standing ovation.